Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to our study in the story of Jesus. Today is session 24, so we're really getting along in the story. And as a matter of fact, what we will see today, what we're going to look at, will be really the beginning of Jesus heading toward Jerusalem, really for the Passion Week. So we're moving right along. Just a couple of things that I wanted to say before we jumped into the actual study today. One is, if you're watching this week, when we've recorded it, this is actually Thanksgiving week, and so wanted to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and hope you have a grateful time this year. And also, I was just thinking that then we hit Black Friday, where everybody starts getting a little bit panicked about Christmas presents. I want to put another plug in on my book. A number of friends of mine have given a number of these, or are going to, ordered 5 or 6 to give to friends. It's really a great gift because it can really influence a person's life. So let me encourage you. You can go to Amazon.com and get that. I also just wanted to say, as we come to the year end, we do all of this under a nonprofit ministry called the Telos Project, and I know you start getting sieged, as we already are, with requests for year-end support from different ministries and organizations, and I know there's a lot of great ones out there, but I would just say that if you think about it and feel so inclined, the Telos Project could use your support too. And the emails that go out, if you are on Facebook, you don't get the address, you could always email me and I'll get it to you, but the address to Telos Project is on the bottom of your email. So I think that was the only little announcement kind of things I wanted to make. I do want to do one thing a little different to start today, because I had a question that came in after last week's session, and it was phrased very appropriately. And an old friend actually sent it, saying they knew this wasn't the point of the parable. Of course, we looked at the parable of the prodigal son together last time. But the question I thought was important enough that I thought I ought to respond a little bit before we got into today's study. And what the question was that if you have a prodigal, an adult son or daughter that has drifted away, how do you keep your hope up? This was the question. How do you keep your hope up like the prodigal's father was able to do? She asked if I might make a couple of comments, and I'm, I don't have any magic formula, but just a few things that came to my mind. And the person realized this, first of all, it's a parable. It's a story. It has a happy ending. The prodigal came home. The father in the parable actually is represents God the Father. So he has an advantage over us when it comes to hope, I guess you could say. And actually, if you look at it, I think that the parable, in some ways, you could say is bad parenting that you'd want to avoid. Probably in terms of good parenting, giving the inheritance would have been a mistake, but that wasn't the point of the parable, obviously. Also, the fact that there were no consequences when the prodigal came home. But again, it's a picture of us and our relationship with God, so it's hard to draw any kind of an answer, really, to the question out of the parable itself. In real life, things just don't happen in the same way that they did in first century Israel, so that's another kind of gap there. But just a couple of thoughts, and hopefully they don't sound too cliche, but the things that came to my mind. First of all, I know that that is a hard and a heartbreaking situation. Anxiety producing, you're always worried about your kids. It doesn't make any difference how old they are. And I'm really sorry for those of you that are going through that right now. That's kind of my first thought when I read the question. I would say, first of all, keep praying. And I know that you've been doing that. But God is probably doing something you can't see. Sometimes we pray, we feel very discouraged because we don't see a response. But a lot of times we just can't see what God is doing. This is a little bit of a negative, but you might not live long enough to see your prodigal return. It's one thought, and again, I know that's not overly encouraging, but just know that that doesn't mean that they won't return. It just means that sometimes it takes a long time. Not all prodigals do return. That's the sad part also, so I don't want to discourage you, but we know that that's a fact. I would say, if possible, you maintain the relationship, and if conversations about faith have been something that has produced conflict, I actually would encourage you, don't talk about faith until they bring it up. Just try and love them and maintain some kind of relationship. And I mostly thought about you, the parents, that are struggling with this. And I think that, if you're severely struggling, that it's really negatively influencing your life, you should really consider getting some help. I know some of you probably have done that, but some professional counseling, sometimes for your sake, just to get a little bit of help in terms of the weight and what all goes on there. Also, if you try and find a group of other parents, I think same-sex is a better way to go, just because I think you can be more open and honest. But if you can find a group who have prodigals themselves and meet together as kind of a support group, talking about it really helps in terms of your own anxiety. Even when that talking is done with a lot of tears, you might find that having that kind of a group, even if it only meets like once a month, just to talk through about the status of how things are going. I did this when my first wife had Alzheimer's, and there were 8 of us. All of us had wives that had the disease, and we met together, and most of the time we just updated the status of our wives, and we cried a lot. But it was helpful. I found it to be extremely helpful. So that might be another step you could take. Spiritually, I think you can read the Psalms. David had a prodigal, and we don't oftentimes think about that, but Absalom, his son, who actually had a tragic ending, but in the Psalms, oftentimes we can get some comfort. And, I think finally, and this is so hard for all of us, is to try to come to terms with the fact that this is something that is really out of your control. It's not really something, particularly with an adult child, you've got to just, again, put it in God's hands and know that maybe there's nothing you personally can do other than trying to keep yourself healthy. Again, I feel that pain for you, and hopefully that might be a little bit helpful. So, with having said all of that, let's get back to the story of Jesus. And again, today we're in session 24. And as we begin today, we're going to look at 2 events that take place as Jesus really just begins his journey into Jerusalem. And that journey begins with Jesus going through the ancient town of Jericho. Probably the way that it's written, he would have been approaching from the east and heading through town. So, the disciples, they're on the road, and again, they're coming to the end of the story, you might say. So, Jericho is down here. It is in what's now called the Western Bank under Palestinian control, but you can see that they would have had crossed over the Jordan at some point in time, and they're heading into Jericho. And as they approach Jericho, they encounter a blind beggar. So we read this. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. And when he heard the crowd going by, he asked, "What's happening?" A blind beggar, he hears a commotion. He's not quite sure what's going on. And by the way, in Mark's gospel, we're actually told his name. We're told that this blind beggar's name was Bartimaeus. And he asks what's going on with all of this commotion, because obviously he can't see. And he is told that Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. Now, looking at the rest of the story, I think it's probably pretty accurate to speculate that he's heard about Jesus. And he's not only heard about Jesus, but perhaps he's actually heard specifically that Jesus has healed blind people. And, he does it differently. It's so interesting. So you might remember back in John chapter 9, he healed a blind man, but he spit in the dirt, he made mud, he put it on the blind man's eyes and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. Nothing like that happens in this particular instant, but the blind man begins to shout out, we're told in the text. He called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Son of David was a messianic title. And so I think we could say that Bartimaeus, even as a blind man and not having the opportunities perhaps others have, has come to the point where he really believes that Jesus is the Messiah. We're told that they try and quiet him down from calling out. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." We aren't exactly told who it was that tried to quiet it down. You might remember we didn't look at this specific event because we've just been hitting some highlights. But remember, at a point in time, children were coming to Jesus, and the disciples tried to turn them away. And of course, Jesus said, "Let the children come to me," because it's people like them that have a childlike heart. That's who the kingdom belongs to, and he blessed them. So here, again, we aren't told specifically who it is, but again, they try to quiet him down. I like this guy. I really like the blind beggar because he doesn't cave in. As a matter of fact, he shouts all the more. And as he does, we're told that Jesus stopped and ordered the man be brought to him. He has faith that Jesus can heal him. That's why he is crying out to him. And again, he continues to cry out until they bring him to Jesus, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And we'll see in a minute the results of the fact that he believed Jesus could heal him. So Jesus calls for him and he's brought to Jesus. Jesus asks him a very interesting question. And you might think, well, that's kind of silly. When he came near, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" I was thinking back, another one of the healing incidents that we didn't get into was the cripple at the pool of Bethesda, who had been there 38 years waiting to get into the pool because there was this rumor or tradition that when the waters were stirred up that it was an angel, and if you could get into the pool first, you could be healed. Well, for 38 years he couldn't get into the pool, and of course Jesus came along, and Jesus asks him, "Do you want me to make you well?" do you want me to heal you? Now that, again, might sound like kind of a silly question, but the fact of the matter is that, it could be a situation where the person was, this was just such a part of their life that day by day they were going through the same motions, nothing was happening, and Jesus wants to know, do you really want me to heal you? So here he asks, what do you want me to do for you? And Bartimaeus answers him, Lord, I want to see. And the result is that Jesus heals him. And Jesus doesn't do anything particular. We're simply told that Jesus said to him, maybe didn't even touch him, certainly didn't put mud in his eyes, but Jesus said to him, receive your sight, your faith has healed you. And the result is that Bartimaeus is healed, and he's not only healed, but we're told then that he actually joins the crowd, because we've been told earlier that as he's coming to Jericho that there are crowds that are with him, and the result is that immediately after Jesus said this, Bartimaeus received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. I have to tell you this story. Some of you, I'm sorry it won't mean a lot to you, but I know that there are some of you that are watching that knew or were involved with Rich Beach. Richard was my spiritual father and mentor, and he used to give a message that he called Blind Bart Gets a New Start. And it was based upon, of course, this incident in the life of Jesus, and that's what's happened here. Not only did Bartimaeus, when he was blind, have faith in Jesus, but when Jesus healed him, he began to follow Jesus, and he becomes part of the crowd that now is going to go through Jericho and ultimately begins that journey to Jerusalem. Also, I might point out that in the Gospel of Matthew, we're told two different things than we're told in the Gospel of Luke. Matthew makes reference to the fact, he says there were two blind men, and he says that the healing took place as Jesus was heading out of Jericho, not heading into Jericho. Now, I don't know specifically how to reconcile 1 versus 2, but there is an interesting fact about Jericho that would fit in with one of the disciples, one of the writers actually of the Gospels, saying that there were two men versus Luke simply identifying one man. And that is that there were two Jerichos. I mean, they were built right together. But first of all, you might remember that this is the same Jericho that was destroyed by Joshua and the Israelites around 1400 BC. And Jericho, we think historically perhaps was the oldest inhabited city in the world. And there's an archaeological site there. Let me see, I thought I had a little picture here. When we took a trip, a group of us, to Israel, we actually had lunch right next to this fountain, which of course, first of all, identified Jericho as the oldest city in the world. But this fountain and the restaurant sat right next to the archaeological dig that was done on Jericho, and they were able to dig down and identify that there were it was an inhabited city as early as 8,000 BC. But the old city had been destroyed, and obviously it had been destroyed at least once by Joshua at the time of the conquest. But when it was rebuilt next to the old site. So there was an old Jerusalem, a new Jerusalem. It was actually possible to be entering into Jerusalem at the same time you were exiting Jerusalem. Because if you were going through, Jericho, yes, it was actually possible to be leaving old Jericho and entering new Jericho. So that doesn't necessarily need to be a conquest. Interestingly, back when Joshua destroyed the city, there was a curse that went along with it, and it was said that cursed is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city. I am not exactly sure that we have any historical evidence of what happened when people tried to rebuild it, but they obviously did. And again, this is 1,400 years after the destruction in the book of Joshua. And it was sometimes called the City of Palms. It was like almost a resort spot, an oasis in the desert, and it was the second largest city in the region after Jerusalem. So the man, Jesus begins to head through the city, we're told. Let's see if we can get a little bit of the text there. Okay, so the first verse in chapter 19 of Luke, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. So again, there's crowds, we're told. We kind of see that. And we're then told that a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. And he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. So crowds have come out to see Jesus. And one man in particular is pointed out for us here, and his name is Zacchaeus. Really given 4 characteristics of this man just in one verse there. One is that we're told that he was a chief tax collector. That would have meant that under the Roman system of taxation, he would have been kind of the regional head of all the other tax collectors. And you might remember back when we talked about Matthew, Levi becoming one of the disciples, that the Romans sold their taxing franchises to people that were indigenous. And so in this case, in Judea, franchises were sold to Jews. And so the Jews themselves became tax collectors of other Jews. And what would happen was they paid a certain amount to the Romans, which was the amount of tax that was required. And then they would collect taxes from the Jews, and they would generally pad the required amount, and they would keep the balance. Well, Zacchaeus probably not only has done that, but it's quite possible that as the chief tax collector, he even got a cut of what was collected by the other taxpayers, because the second characteristic that I would point out from the text is that he was wealthy. So he was a rich tax collector. He was, of course, Jericho was a rich city, but again, because he was the chief tax collector, that's probably part of why he was identified as being wealthy. And he really would have been hated by his fellow Jews. And that's, something that we know from our previous look, particularly at Matthew, and our look at tax collectors. That he was like a traitor, to the nation, and he was working for the Romans, so he would have been hated by the Jews. We're told that not only was he the chief tax collector and was wealthy, but we're also told that one of his characteristics was that he was short. He wanted to see who Jesus was, excuse me, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So third characteristic we know about him, not only was he chief tax collector, not only was he rich, but he was short. And the consequence was that he couldn't see Jesus. And by the way, the fourth characteristic that we know from the text is simply this: he wants to see Jesus. That's why he's there, and he can't see him. And perhaps when you look at the text, why would he be so anxious to see Jesus? Well, one reason I can think of is that Jesus had this kind of this identity that had been used, and when the Pharisees and religious leaders talked about him, they often referred to him as a friend of sinners and tax collectors. And perhaps, and I think that's a pretty good speculation, Zacchaeus had heard that this Jesus guy was actually a friend of tax collectors, and he wanted to see him. He wanted to see him. He can't see over the crowd. So what he does, we're told, is he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. This is actually a shot that I took in Jericho when we were there. This traditionally is actually the tree, supposedly, that Zacchaeus climbed to see Jesus. We don't know that, but it's a very, very old sycamore tree there that is, as you're going down sort of the main drag of Jericho, you would see. So Zach climbs the tree, and as the kind of the crowd moves forward, eventually Jesus comes to that tree, and he looks up and he speaks to Zacchaeus. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." Now, Jesus invites himself to dinner with Zacchaeus, and the crowds, they disapprove of this. They, as they see Jesus interacting with Zacchaeus. But Zacchaeus, we're told, came down at once and welcomed him gladly. And so as we move on, all the people saw this and they began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." Now, we've seen this response over and over and over again. This time it's not just the religious leaders, it's all the people that are watching this happen, because again, they're probably people that weren't very fond of Zacchaeus. They hate this guy, they disapprove. And Zacchaeus is going to have a dinner now for Jesus, very parallel in a sense to what happened also with Matthew. And of course you can ask the question, well, who would come to dinner at his house? And the response is, well, it was probably other tax collectors and, quote, sinners. One of the things I was thinking about this week had never really struck me before. It is true. One of the things, if you look for it as you read through the Gospels, is that a lot of events in the Gospel take place around a meal. Jesus seemed to always, be having dinner with someone, and there were really two groups of people that he had dinner with. Now, in their culture, having dinner together was much different than it is in our culture. I mean, we might grab a quick meal and head out and not have much happen around the table, but this was the major social event of the culture, and being invited to dinner or going to dinner was a real kind of a special event. And so Jesus has a lot of dinners in the Gospels. But there are two different kinds of dinners. One is on a number of occasions, and we've seen at least one of those as we've moved through the story. He would have dinner with the religious leaders, and it always seemed like some kind of conflict came up when he had dinner with them, and they were always seemed to be watching him, trying to see if he would make a mistake. I don't think that would facilitate a very warm kind of a climate for a dinner event. But the other group is that he seems to consistently then have dinner with the renegades like Matthew and like Zacchaeus, the tax collectors and prostitutes and others that were considered sinners by the religious establishment. And my hunch is he seemed to always have a good time at those dinners. So this is a dinner with the tax collectors and the sinners. And what we see in the text is that something has happened to Zacchaeus. And at a point in the dinner, we're told that Zacchaeus stands up and addresses Jesus. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times that amount." Now, he tells Jesus he's going to give half his wealth to the poor. You might remember the rich young ruler. We didn't really look at that particular event, but Jesus said to him, "Sell everything you have and give to the poor. Come and follow me." In this particular situation, Jesus seems to be quite pleased that, first of all, Zacchaeus is going to give half of his wealth to the poor, and he's also going to do some restitution. If I've cheated anybody, now that is sort of a rhetorical kind of a statement there, because it's probable, maybe beyond probable, maybe definite that in his life as a tax collector, he has cheated people. Now, the interesting thing is that under Jewish law, if you cheated someone or robbed someone and you were caught, you didn't confess it yourself, but you were caught doing it, then you were required to pay double the amount of what you had robbed or cheated them of. If you confessed that you'd cheated or robbed someone, then you were only required to pay them the amount that was robbed or cheated, and a 1/5 of whatever that amount was you paid as part of your restitution. Well, Nicodemus goes far beyond either of those and says, "I'll pay back 4 times the amount." Something has definitely happened to Zacchaeus, not Nicodemus. I'm sorry, I keep saying that. Anyway, because he's suddenly, the thing that probably all of his life was the most important to him, being money, he's giving away. He's giving away half of all of his wealth, and he's going the extra mile to pay back anybody he might have cheated. And then he sits back down. And Jesus' response is very important to him. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." That's a great statement by Jesus. I think that's one that we should all memorize. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. That was Jesus' purpose. Now, let me just say that the first thing that might come to our mind is that, well, it was the tax collectors and the sinners that were the lost, and so Jesus didn't really come for the religious leaders. But the reality is everybody is lost. And Jesus came to seek and save everyone. It's just that some didn't really think that they were lost, and that tended to be the self-righteous religious leaders. So I really like that. I think you ought to memorize that statement. A couple of quick thoughts, and one would be, the first question you might ask is, well, was Zacchaeus given the gift of salvation because he gave half his money away? And I would say the answer to that is no. It wasn't because of something like that he did. that then earned him salvation. And the other question would be, or did Zacchaeus give half his money away because he had just been given the gift of salvation? He had faith in Jesus, and this was an expression of that faith in Jesus. And again, I would say I believe that that's what has gone on here, that because of his faith in Jesus as the Son of Man, the Messiah had come, and the relationship that had already begun to develop there, that he gives this away as a response to that faith. And because of his faith, salvation came to Zacchaeus. Again, I keep thinking about the rich young ruler here. Jesus was pleased that Zacchaeus would give half his wealth away. Now, let me make a couple of comments about that also. There's a good possibility that Zacchaeus needed the other half. We know historically, based upon Eusebius's early history of the Christian church, it was written in the 4th century, so there are, going back this far, sometimes you need to wonder a little bit about the accuracy, but supposedly he did his homework before he wrote that book. At some point, Zacchaeus quits his job. He quits being a tax collector. And after the resurrection, we're told that Zacchaeus became part of the early church. And again, one tradition actually says that he changed his name to Matthias. And of course, Matthias was the one that was chosen to replace Judas. And that was one tradition that sprung up. But with a little bit more of certainty, when the church spread to the Roman capital of Judea, which was Caesarea Maritima on the coast of the Mediterranean, Eusebius says that Zacchaeus became the first pastor of that church. And that would make a lot of sense because, again, Caesarea Maritima was a Roman city, and here was a man that had worked for the Romans, that probably understood the Roman culture better than many of the other Jews, and has this faith in Jesus, and becomes a leader in the early church, which I think is a really kind of a cool little story. So Jesus then goes on. He tells another parable. And then what we're told is that Jesus now is going to head to Jerusalem, which would have been a walk of several days. There was a Roman road that had been built from Jericho to Jerusalem, which is probably why Jesus was going through Jericho. And it would have been several days' walk. Then I found contradictory information on the distance between Jericho and Jerusalem, but I think the accurate number is it was about 26 miles away. And so it was a good hike, and that Jesus takes off on in order to enter into Jerusalem. And that entry into Jerusalem, and then the first thing that Jesus does when he arrives there is where we will pick up next week in our next session together. But just realize that rapidly now we're heading toward the climax of the story over the next couple of weeks. And I would also say, remember that the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And we were lost. And Jesus came to seek us and to save us. So thanks for joining us today in this part of the story of Jesus. And again, we're getting ready to head into some very significant events in the life of Christ as we move through the next couple of weeks. And I'll see you then.